Shabbat Shalom once again. It's so wonderful to see everybody's faces, and we look forward to being able to be together in really only a matter of time, a couple of weeks. When you think of Jewish religious life, what is the first word that comes to mind? In my mind, that word would be mitzvah, or commandment. Our religion is filled with mitzvot, commandments of what to do, what not to do, when to do them, when not to do them. And that works great for me, because as your ritual director, I'm pretty competent in all of our fixed rituals which help make up our daily, weekly, monthly, and yearly lives. But it's also what left me a bit uncomfortable after looking closely at this week's Parsha, Parshat Vayikra. Let me explain. But first, I need to give you a little bit of background. In our Tuesday and Friday mornings examining our liturgy teachings, we recently studied a piece of Talmud that records an argument over where our prayer services come from. The Talmud records in Brachot 26b, it was stated, Rabbi Yossi, son of Rabbi Hanina, said, prayers were instituted by the patriarchs. However, Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi said that the prayers were instituted based on the daily offerings sacrificed in the Holy Temple, and the prayers parallel the offerings in terms of both time and characteristics. What is the crux of this debate? Do we really care where specifically our prayer services come from? It turns out that the source of our prayers can also inform us as to the nature of our prayers. If the source of our prayers is based on the daily offerings, then everything seems very fixed in nature. This is when you do it, and this is how you do it. Just like we are told in Parshat Titzaveh a few weeks ago, when Aaron receives the instructions for the Tamid, the daily offerings in the Mishkan, the portable tabernacle. On the other hand, if our prayers are modeled after Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, well, that would seem to indicate something more individualistic. Our forefathers had no obligation or instructions to pray. They prayed when they were moved to pray, and for each of them, it was at a different time of day, and they prayed about different things. It was spontaneous. It was from the heart. So what would cause me, the guy who prides himself on knowing his way around our fixed rituals, so much discomfort in reading this week's Parsha? After all, it's all about sacrifices. That is the type of service that seems fixed. You know, the stuff I'm good at. But as I read about these offerings, these were not the fixed offerings that Aaron was supposed to sacrifice on behalf of the congregation twice daily. These were all personal offerings. We're told about the following offerings: the olah, or burnt offering, which was a voluntary sacrifice that had a high degree of sanctity and was regarded as the standard offering. The entire animal, except for the hide, was burned on the altar. In other words, it was a sacrifice in its entirety to God. It was therefore entirely selfless, with the bringer deriving no benefit. The mincha offering, the meal offering, was a sacrifice made out of flour, oil, salt, and frankincense that was partly burned on the altar and partly given to the priest to eat. The zebach shlamim, or sacrifice of well-being, was a voluntary animal offering from one's herd, sometimes brought to fulfill a vow. This offering was partially burnt on the altar, partially given to the priest, but most of it remained in the prerogative of the bringer to eat and share with family and friends. Then we read about the chatat, the sin offering, which I referenced earlier, which was an obligatory sacrifice that was offered to expiate for unintentional sins. And finally, the asham, or a penalty offering, which was an obligatory sacrifice of a ram that was required of someone who sinned without knowing, only to later realize the sin. And God spends this whole parsha, 5 chapters long, and then a large part of next week's parsha, talking about the details of these 5 personal sacrifices, 3 of which are totally voluntary, and the other 2 are only required in response to certain wrong actions or sins we commit. So theoretically, a person can go their whole lives without offering any of these sacrifices. Yet God spends a parsha and a half describing these sacrifices. On the other hand, God tells about the Tamid sacrifice, the twice daily offering that Aaron and his sons were to bring on behalf of the community, in a total of 5 sentences back in Parshat Titzaveh. To put it in our modern prayer framework, God is telling us, pray your fixed prayer every day, In fact, you can have your leader, Aaron, discharge your obligation for you. However, what I really desire, what I really long for, is for you to come to me and approach me with your prayers and your supplications that come from your hearts, the prayers that move you. And yes, even your penitent prayers. That is what I desire. So I will spend a parsha and a half explaining those sacrifices in loving detail to you. And now you know the source of my discomfort. This is not the stuff I'm good at. I've told this story before, but I'll relate it once again. Shelley and I were having dinner with non-Jewish friends. The host said a beautiful blessing about all his bounty and his family and about his health and well-being and whatnot. When done, he looked at me and asked if I wanted to say a blessing. And all I could think of was, Hamotzi lecha min haaretz. And yes, part of what I try to do is to bring meaning to our fixed prayer and liturgy so that we can make them our own personal prayers. But our tradition wants us to offer prayers that are truly personal and come from our hearts. It's a real dichotomy. On the one hand, there is something so powerful, so uniting, so uplifting about an entire community, in fact, a whole nation, praying the same words together. And it is fixed and needs to be fixed so that everyone prays together. But we are remiss if we do not approach God with what God demonstrates so much love for in this week's and next week's Parsha, our own prayers that come from the heart. This is what the rabbis found so meaningful in the prayer of Hannah, the mother of the prophet Samuel, which is the Haftarah we read on the first day of Rosh Hashanah. On the one hand, they were able to read into her prayer all the themes of the 18 blessings we recite in our weekday Amidah. So she recited all of the fixed prayer, our fixed prayer obligations. On the other hand, the Haftarah tells us that Hannah was praying in her heart, only her lips moved, but her voice could not be heard. Her prayer was so personal, so deeply felt that she didn't dare say the words out loud for another human to hear, only God. And our rabbis learned from this that the Amidah is supposed to be recited silently because your prayer should be deeply personal, meaningful, and heartfelt to you. In a few moments, we'll hear from Rabbi Daniel Graber, and he will discuss with us his own struggles to find room within the structures of obligatory Judaism, which only calls for certain mourners, certain relatives, to mourn the loss of a loved one, and his struggle to be able to mourn for a beloved friend for whom he was not obligated to mourn, but deeply wished to from the bottom of his heart. What we must take away from this morning's parsha is that these expressions of prayer that come from the heart are just as important and perhaps even more beloved to God than our fixed prayer. As the Talmud tells us in Tractate Brachot 29b, Rabbi Eliezer says, one whose prayer is fixed, his prayer is not supplication. Stunned by this assertion, since we say fixed prayer 3 times a day, every day, the Gemara asks, what is the meaning of fixed in this context? And the Gemara answers, Rabbah and Rav Yosef both said, it refers to anyone unable to introduce a novel element, i.e. something personal, reflecting one's personal needs to one's prayer, and only recites the standard formula.